Thanks for joining us today. I'm Safia Kazi, and I'm the Principal of Privacy Professional Practices at ISACA. Joining me today are two very special guests, Freund and Natalie Jorion. They're here to discuss their recently released journal article, The True Cost of a Data Breach. Natalie, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Now, just to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce us, and let us know what your background is and what it is that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, I'm the Vice President and Head of Cyber Risk Methodology at BitSight. I've been in this role for a couple years by way of acquisition. Previously, was at a Moody startup that was recently acquired. Prior to that, I've done some consulting work and then also worked full time in financial organizations doing cyber risk quantification. My background in this goes back at least 17 years, doing a lot of work in risk assessment, risk management, and risk quantification. Most notably, the co-author of the book on the FAIR risk assessment methodology.
Great, thanks. And Natalie, can you introduce yourself to our audience and give us a little bit of information about your background?
Hi, yeah, I'm Natalie Jorion. And I'm a principal data scientist at BitSight. I've been working there for 2 years. And prior to that, I was a psychometrician working on different assessments. And so I specialize in assessment validation and different assessment methodologies.
Great, thanks. Now, I want to get into your article a little bit. We've worked together on articles for years now, but I'm curious about this specific topic. Why did you two want to write an article about the cost of a data breach specifically?
Well, we had a problem practically that we were trying to solve for, and just by way of contextualizing this, in those past, let's call it 15 years, doing risk quantification, there's been a definite dearth of data, and developed a lot of methods and leveraged a lot of methods for sort of circumventing that, doing SME calibrated estimates, and then putting those into calculations. But we've really kind of reached a tipping point here in the last couple of years where there's enough data to be able to make some reasonable assessments about stuff. Now, once you start doing this, you obviously want more data. So what we tried to do is find a way to interpolate from the data that we did have and flush out the rest of the data that we needed for these records. So that was one of the reasons why I asked Natalie to help with some of her background to sort of find a way to adjust some of the data sets where we had missing costs to really be able to sort of build a more robust data set to make a reliable estimate for these loss projections. But we didn't want to just put in any data. We have to have the right data. And that's where some of the methods we talk about in this article really came to the forefront.
Yeah, and why is it important for leaders to be able to convey the negative impact, financial impact specifically, of cyber incidents?
Yeah, I have a funny quip I say about this, and that's for years, CISOs and security organizations were pleading with the boards of directors to pay attention to cybersecurity. And the good news is we've reached that point where boards are going to pay attention to cybersecurity and are paying attention to cybersecurity. And the bad news is the boards are paying attention to cybersecurity. And by that I mean that the broader investment communities that the boards are familiar with interacting with, largely credit analysts and underwriting through insurance, and even just straight up investor communities themselves, are really trying to understand, especially with the uptick in ransomware incidents, what the impact of cyber failures look like to operations. And it's at that point that the only real language that exists to be able to properly communicate that is through the use of risk quantification, which, by the way, just sort of brings cybersecurity on par with other operational risk and enterprise risk management practices, where they try and express those losses in similar terms that way. So that's why the CISOs that are really maturing their own skill sets and the practices in their organization are leveraging cyber risk quantification to a certain degree to be able to build a more robust package of presentation to those boards to be able to say, here's what loss projections look like, here's what our insurance looks like, here's what control maturity looks like, here's what assessments looks like, and it becomes a part of that palette of presentations that you give to those board directors.
Yeah, and I know one of the things that you said in your article is that data breaches are underreported. Why is that?
There's some interesting perspectives about why that is, and some of these things I've heard secondhand. We happen to have really good sunshine laws here in the United States, where people are able and compelled to disclose these types of things. In some other countries around the world, I hear from those that are experts on that that's not quite the case. And even if they do report that an incident occurred, or somehow the press becomes aware of it, all the details available to that are not readily available too. And this is sort of where you have this, call for this sort of in the U.S. we have the National Highway Traffic Safety Boards, where all these data becomes available and you can run reports on them that way. So there is sort of a information asymmetry that exists between what an organization knows about these particular incidents and then what the broader community knows about it, and that sort of limits what you're able to do because you don't have complete data in this way.
Yeah, and one of the things you talk about in your article are direct and indirect costs that might be associated with a cyber attack. What's the difference between the two, and what are some of the costs, direct or indirect, that might result from a cyber attack?
This one's for Natalie. Natalie, you go
Oh,
ahead and take this one. You
okay.
spent some time with this.
Sure. So, direct costs include expenses from forensic investigations, fines, compensations to affected parties. So, indirect costs are ones associated with losses from internal productivity, communications regarding the status and the effect of the breach, and business opportunities lost from reputational harm and customer turnover.
That's really interesting because some of the things you mention, especially for indirect costs, seem like they're things that you may not even factor in or experience for a couple of years. Are organizations doing a good job of understanding, okay, we had a breach in, let's say, 2018. What are the ramifications and how is it costing us now, potentially in 2023?
Organizations broadly, probably not to the degree they should. And let me just sort of calibrate that response a little bit. I think part of that, part of the way that these costs play out over time is in large part due to the speed of the legal systems in which they're operating. It just takes time to go through discovery and class action lawsuits, which is relatively a US based sort of thing, but happens in other countries too. And because it takes so long, that immediate cost is not necessarily felt. And by the time that the large numbers hit, there's a different investment trend happening at the same time. So there's a lot of different impacts that take time to play out. There's appeals, there's et cetera, that also goes through there. Even in some of the insurance cases that you see playing out, where there was silent cyber coverage, where they're trying to get cyber losses claimed through property and casualty type policies. There's some court cases involved in there too. So you're right. Those indirect costs are a little squishier, and they sometimes don't materialize in the current reporting period, and that does mean that there is a necessary practice where you have to go back and update the data sets with the revised information when they happen, to sort of get a full stream account of what those impacts look like.
Yeah, I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with Ponemon's cost of data breach annual reports. Can you tell us a little bit about how they go about calculating the costs and then some of the potential drawbacks used by the simple model that's used in those reports?
I can take this one. So, the way that the Poneman Institute calculates the potential data breach cost is through an average. So, it's basically the number, the total monetary cost divided by the records lost. So, I think in 2021, they cited that it would be 161 per record lost. And you just do the calculation to figure out how much you could potentially lose in a year. And I think part of the reason why this this model is so frequently cited in cybersecurity reports, it's because it's so simple. Um, all the companies have to do is if they know the number of records they have, they just multiply it by this cost, which is 161 in this case, and then they can figure out what they can expect to lose. Um, the problem with this is also that it's very simple. Some other research found that some of the this estimated cost per record explained a very small percentage of the variance in the data. So I believe Jacobs for 2014 found that Hahnemann Institute's model explained only 2% of the variance in the data. Um, so there's so many more factors that go into a data breach will end up costing. And what's more is that this cost per record heuristic is becoming less accurate in more recent years, probably in part due to the rise of ransomware.
Yeah, especially for those incidents that don't involve records at all, there becomes this sort of gap in understanding and knowledge about what that's going to cost. Yeah, I think it's deceptively simple, and that's appealing to organizations that don't have a strong risk quantification understanding and practice. So banks sort of get it a little bit better than other organizations because they're forced to think about financial risk in a more complicated way. Other organizations that don't have a strong maturity level in that space can sometimes be sucked into these values. And the danger of it is that you under allocate resources based on a deceptively simple number that is going to expose your organization so that you don't have the proper risk transfer controls in place. You don't have the right budget enabled to mitigate risk. Um, so it's more than just a wrong number. It's actually a dangerous number because it can keep you from properly managing risk.
Yeah, on that note, your article talks a lot about some different methods to calculate the cost of a breach. And one of the ones that I found really interesting was estimating cost as a function of annual revenue. So, why might a model that does that do a better job predicting direct costs, but not these indirect costs?
Yeah, I think there's value in sort of looking at those immediate costs, that those sort of direct costs that you see in a breach or in this security incidents in general. What you tend to find is that larger organizations have more money to spend on a thing, and they're more practiced in that. So you sort of have this ability to better understand, what those immediate responses are going to be. So whether it's, um, loaded cost rates for employee responses or data breach notification letters and subsequent identity theft coverages. Uh, those things are fairly well defined and well known. And or large organizations tend to have large amounts of customers, so they sort of have this mapping of those costs tend to step fairly well that way. It's the indirect costs, like we talked about, that are a little trickier. Some of it probably is a function of um, revenue. Larger companies have deeper pockets, so people sue them more often, and the payouts tend to be higher. That's a thing that you can rationalize. But the other indirect costs also tend to be fairly squishy. So when you're trying to come up with an exact number for that, the cost of missed opportunity tends to be a little more difficult to predict that way. So there are some aspects of that that make it a little more complicated, and that's when you have to sort of look at the data to see if there's other things that are telling, uh, that are helpful for you to be able to figure out what those losses are going to look like, all in.
And your article leveraged a lot of information from the Advisen data breach data. Can you tell us a little bit about how that specific data set gave further insights into the relationships between dependent variables, missing and non-missing data?
Yeah, I can talk a little about that. So Advisen is a rich data set that has cases from several decades, and it contains about 150 different variables associated with each cyber incident. And so this allowed us to look at what different factors were related to the cost of a data breach. Um, so due to underreporting, though, as Jack mentioned before, there's quite a bit of missing data. So before running our analysis, it was important to investigate if there was some missing data or not missing data, and whether that was associated with whether it was missing or not.
It's a very reliable data set. A lot of insurance companies use the advising data set and some of their underwriting practices for cyber insurance. They also spend a lot of time manually doing Freedom of Information Act requests to try and gather this sort of data. So it's a fairly well curated data set in a space where the data exists, but is often very disparate. So there is value in sort of that consolidation of web scrape data, manual government requests for additional information, and other things. You know, just my own personal opinion. I think it would be great if you found additional data sets where a lot of the cyber insurers begin to make available some of their claims data sets too. I think that's the next step in sort of this data evolution here. You find that with a lot of PNC PNC firms that do property casualty, car insurance, homeowners insurance, life insurance, where they file their rating tables publicly with departments of insurance. I think as the cyber insurance space begins to mature over time, I think you'll find a lot more of these firms, being compelled through regulation or best practice to be able to, share this data a little bit more freely. Um, but in the absence of that kind of stuff, you sort of operate in enough data to do something with, but not enough data that you would like, and that really sort of sets us up to really think about how do we build interpretation into this so that we can begin to flesh out a lot of the missing fields to really make a better and more robust data set.
In your experience, is there kind of a culture of not sharing information about a breach you experienced, either just because of the reputational harm or the secrecy or just wanting to keep things secret? Or are organizations relatively open about what they've experienced, the costs, etc.?
It's fairly clandestine in almost all these. I mean, there are some ISAC-based organizations that share. Usually, if the sharing occurs, it tends to be very anonymous. There's some private nonprofit organizations in the financial service space that allow you to share operational risk data that way to use in this indexing kind of manner. If our losses look like our peers' losses, what would they look like? There's a lot of in the cybersecurity profession, we talk to each other a lot, so there's a lot of sort of informal knowledge that way. But it really comes to database views of these type of things. It's not very pervasive outside of places where there's regulatory requirements. In the U.S., the Department of Health and Human Services publishes the HIPAA fines data sets. That's very, very public. Um, but what's missing sometimes is what's the proximate cause of that kind of thing. Sure, we had a loss in this amount, but why did it happen? What did we do? What control failed? There's a lot of other stuff I think that can really be matured in terms of really, making the organization, making cybersecurity as a profession more like the aviation industry, where everyone's very clear on, was it human error? Was there a mechanical malfunction? Was there a design error? What are the things that went wrong, and how do we protect that? Um, in the meantime, I think we still find ourselves operating in a little bit of a vacuum sometimes. So organizations that have data available are able to find ways to um, you know do analyses on that data to help the different organizations make some better judgments about their own risk posture and things that they can do to protect themselves.
And what are some variables that might affect the cost of a data breach?
So there's a lot of different variables involved, and we found quite a few of these in the advice and data set. So, for example, we looked at revenue, company revenue, employee count, number of PII records, um, whether there were legal fees involved. So there's a lot of different factors that go into what might affect the cost of a data breach. And one of the interesting things that we also found is that these change over time. And so we initially created one model, and then eventually we created two different models, one after sort of ransomware became more prevalent, and found that there were different variables involved in each of these different models. And this might just have to do with the changing landscape of cyber attacks.
Yeah, it is interesting when you look at the data sets and then you sort of try and overlay a narrative onto why And the one that just really kept coming up was, yeah, I think there's a big difference in the before and after of ransomware scourge that really began uh, during the pandemic, and that sort of, I think, is the best narrative I could come up with for why those things are like that.
Yeah, and also over time, the record counts became less indicative of how much a data breach would cost, and so that was one of the really surprising things that we found, and that sort of shows that the heuristic that the Ponemon Institute uses is becoming less relevant.
Yeah, I'm curious, how are or have privacy laws and regulations affected patterns that we've seen over the past few years? I know one of the things you said in the article is that GDPR fines rose by 40% in 2020. What's the impact of that, or is there an impact of that on the overall cost of a data breach?
Well, I mean, it certainly doesn't help. I think one of the things that you see is somewhat cynically, I think the general public is becoming a little bit less excitable about data breaches, or a little more insulated from it, because they've been happening a long time. In the early days of doing this, I can recall thinking, wow, eventually people are really going to get angry about this. And we generally didn't as a society. We got less and less angry about it over time. So when that kind of thing happens, and you tend to see what people regard as some of this disparaging treatment of companies that mishandle data, then you sort of see what economists call these externalities, where there is a fine, there is a negative impact, and politicians and governments have attempted to sort of monetize that to add additional cost to it. So I think that's what you're seeing generally, is that these are the fines that are being added on top of this, that represent those economic externalities. Uh, what I also understand is that you haven't really seen those fines kick in at the maximum amount, especially from a GDPR perspective. Those maximum amounts of, I forget the precise percentage of turnover, but it's 20 million or 4%, I think, something like that. Those numbers have not really kicked in for most companies. Facebook getting close, but and some people I've spoken to in the European Union somewhat cynically say, well, we don't want to damage our own companies compared to the U.S. by charging these enormous fines that way. So I think that's part of what you're seeing in these data sets is the fines, even in the U.S. with CCPA and other ones, like we want companies to behave appropriately, but at the same time, the people whose data is involved, this is my own personal opinion, are sort of becoming less and less concerned about it, generally because it happens a lot. Uh, Years ago in conferences, I used to ask people to raise their hand if they've been subject, if their data has been subject to a data breach, and then keep their hands up if they've changed to a different business as a result of that. And I don't think anybody would be surprised to know that very few people kept their hands up, and it was really only the people that sort of had this really real moral indignation about the way that their stuff was treated. So most people stick with the same organization after a data breach, so you don't really see a lot of customer desertions that way, and for better or for worse. And even if you did, it would assume that you knew something about the control state of the other company you were going to, which obviously you don't. Typically, staying with the same company is, in my personal opinion, a better bet, because they're probably going to do something about those control states and make things better, at least for a little while. Um, so anyway, long way of answering the question, but I think it's not helping in terms of the amount of money. I think it's doing that because regulatory authorities believe there is some economic externality that they're trying to account for, and that in particular, that regulatory component is making boards very cautious of doing business. And then there is this sort of calculation internally around, how do we balance innovation with privacy, and that becomes a very interesting risk management question, actually.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that someone's data might be breached and they might just stay with the company anyway. But I think I hear a lot of conversations about reputational harm and damaging the trust between a data subject and an organization. But this idea of reputational harm seems, to take your term, Jack, very squishy. How do you go about calculating this or just thinking about it from a data breach perspective? What are some of the things that might make up reputational harm? And is it worth being a factor when you're calculating the cost of a breach?
Oh, of course it is. In the fair risk methodology, we spent a lot of time talking about reputation calculations, and we really looked at it from a couple different perspectives. And the variables that, if you decompose it down, that are useful are things like, stock price, cost of capital, and market share. Those are really big things there. And normally you have these sort of like Fairmay type questions where you say, when you say reputation, what do you mean? And it typically boils down to, we want to keep the customers that we have, and we want to be able to we want to be able to acquire as many new customers as possible. That's sort of what we're trading on when we have our reputation here. Uh, the initial reaction of a company from a PR perspective and an incident response perspective tends to be very telling in terms of how people deal with this. This is why you sort of get those "we're taking this very seriously" kind of reactions, which are generally considered best practice, if not somewhat antiseptic. But those results are very helpful. It's if you have further complications after that, or you fail to disclose how bad things were in the beginning, and so on and so forth, that's when people tend to get a sour taste in their mouth. Um, we spent a lot of time talking about this notion of reputational risk in terms of what's the primary value proposition of an organization. So, do I go to a particular store because they have great security, or do I go because I like the products and services that they sell? And the more aligned that the products and services is to the security practices, the greater that reputational harm tends to be. So if you're going to companies where you're entrusting security into them, and then they themselves have poor security, that tends to hurt their reputation a little bit more or worse. I think it's a difficult problem space, certainly one that is worth mentioning, especially because boards care a lot about it. They do reputational risk assessments. What happens if our products and services are no longer valuable in the marketplace? What do we do then? So those are meaningful questions for sure. Quantifying them becomes a little bit more difficult because you have to sort of make projections around, if our thing failed because we had poor security practices, how many less opportunities are we going to be able to pursue as a result of that? And that really ties pretty greatly to strategy risk assessments and broader mission of an organization.
Yeah, and in your article, you say it is only through continued model validation that the industry can advance the maturity of cybersecurity risk management practices. Why is that the case?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting point, and something I've learned a lot more about from my time working with the team at Moody's is, they're constantly looking for new signal in the noise. Like, what's the next thing that we need to monitor to be able to better predict this? And just like Natalie said, over time, some of those signals become a little arthritic. We no longer can really rely on the count of records to be able to give us a reasonable assessment of what that loss amount's going to be. So we have to find those in other places. And this is really where model validation becomes a very important part of this. If you're working with vendors that are providing you data of any kind like this, you have to sort of take a look at those underlying models and say, how wrong is this model? There's a saying, all models are wrong, some are useful. If a company is marketing its products and its models upon which they're based as being perfect, then they're probably hiding something, because only mature organizations talk about weaknesses in their model and what they're doing to improve them. So I think that's a really important fact to consider there. And I think from a regulatory perspective, you're seeing a lot more interest, especially in financial services, with organizations looking at all of their cybersecurity models and having a better sense of what the inputs are. Are they valid? Are we back testing this? Are we looking at these models to make sure that the results that are projected are actually what occurs? And I think that's only going to really propagate down through organizations that don't have formal model risk management teams. And you're going to see that in a lot of places where this sort of underlying, checking the engine of a particular risk model become more and more important. I mean, with the popularity of AI models today, I think you're even going to see this happening more and more, where we have to better understand and build, explainable AI to really sort of meet uh, some of the customer and regulatory expectations of being able to say, this input plus this processing equals this output, and being able to trace that back and forth. And how reasonable is that output, and how correct is it when you look at it historically?
All right. And then before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to add for our listeners and viewers?
Yeah, I'd like to say one thing. So, one thing to keep in mind is that the model that we used and the paper is not meant to be a model that companies should use to calculate losses. I think we updated this model last year, and so it's probably outdated by now. So, the idea is that if practitioners want more accurate estimates, they need to use all the information that they have available to them. They shouldn't be relying on these kind of multiplying numbers by records to get the total cost of a data breach. As I mentioned before, this is really not a great explanatory model given the current events and uh, changes in the cybersecurity landscape. So, um, and also that practitioners generally should be always updating their models on a continual basis, especially when there are significant changes.
Yeah, I think that what Natalie said is spot on. The need for continued vigilance in this space is really paramount here, and I think we as a security practice broadly, especially when you think about um, uh, cyber risk management, quantitative cyber risk management, risk transference through insurance. I think we've exceeded the usefulness of simple models, fortunately and unfortunately. So now you really need to have, fairly clever solutions and leverage um, data analysis in a way that is far beyond simple multiplication at this point.
All right. Well, thank you two so much for joining us.
Thank you for
Thank you.
having us.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for in this episode, but if you're interested in reading Jack and Natalie's full article, be sure to check our episode description box for a link to it. That's all we have for this episode. I'm Safia Kazi, and thank you for tuning in.